This is Black and White Makes Gray, a memoir of an interracial childhood by Judith Davidson. Part 4, Crossing the River. Chapter 13. At the end of my sophomore year, my mother announced she and Evan had found a house they were going to purchase in Northeast Portland, and we would be moving very soon. She promised us that while it was smaller than the house we were currently in, it was in much better condition, and we could expect to have heat during the winter. After the cold winter we had just gotten through, that sounded pretty good to me. I was surprised, though, at her plan to move to Northeast Portland, knowing that for someone who is so deeply connected to the west side of Portland, a move east to the other side of the river could not be easy. Critical as my mother had often been of the leaders and shakers of Portland society, she did so as an insider. I could only imagine the pain it would cause her to have to leave the west side of the river where so many of the stories of her childhood, family, and adult life were embedded, and move to the other side of the Willamette River. While I was pleased to know where we were moving and when, unlike the sudden uprooting that brought us to this old Victorian in Northwest Portland, I had no idea what the new neighborhood or school would be like. I was leaving a high school where, even if I didn't feel I fit that well, I still had friends from 2 different grade schools to nod to in the halls or to say hello in the cafeteria. At Grant High School, where I would start my junior year, I would not know anyone. I hoped some of the other students would be college people, but who was to say what that would mean in this new place on the other side of the river? The house in Northeast Portland was a moderate-sized bungalow, which would have been adequate for a family of 4, but we were now double that size. The 4 older children each had a bedroom upstairs, although Virginia's bedroom was technically an enclosed porch. Vaughn slept on a mattress in the center of the upstairs hall, cordoned off by a low bookshelf. The same bookshelf that used to be in the bedroom I had shared with Janet once upon a time. Phyllis, now nicknamed Fee, slept downstairs in what had been the dining room. Mom and Evan's bedroom was a small study behind the area where Fee slept in a crib. It was tight. One good thing about the new house was that there was no rickety, broken porch on the second floor, nor a sawdust pile of dubious sanitary quality in the basement. There were also no more pigeons cooing among the eaves. Randy and I would both be attending Grant High School, some 20 blocks up Knott Street, and Janet and Virginia would be going to Alameda Grade School, also a good walk from our house. Vaughn and Fee, who would be at home, needed a babysitter if Mom was going to be able to complete her high school teaching credential. What none of us knew was that we were moving to one of the most contested borders between black and white in Portland. Note to Evan. Evan, I never asked you how you felt about making your way back to the other side of the river where black people were supposed to live. We weren't moving to that part of Northeast Portland. We were still within what was officially white Portland, but it was a different way to return now with a family. Or were you indifferent as long as there was a roof over your head, the piano in its place, and the space and time to play your music? I think you were willing to ignore quite a bit if you had those creature comforts. Many young people were living on our block, and Virginia was the first to claim her new circle of friends. Shortly after we had moved to the new neighborhood, Virginia, Steve, Brian, and Valerie were crowded around a board game on the front porch of the house next to ours where Steve lived. "I won!" crowed Virginia, jumping up suddenly like a pop-top. Although at age 9 she was the oldest, she was also the smallest of the group. Sandy-haired Steve, only 7 years old, stood up defiantly. It was his game and his house, and he didn't like it that this new girl in the neighborhood had beat him at his own board game. He yelled, "You're a nigger lover!" She stopped mid-dance and stared at him. She had never been attacked before with this racial slur. Brian and Valerie stared, watching in horrified silence. "You're a nigger lover!" Steve yelled again. At this, Virginia grabbed him by the neck of his green T-shirt and threw all her weight against him, pushing him to the floor and landing on him hard. "Don't you call me that!" She punched him as he thrashed beneath her. "Your stepfather's a nigger," he spit back at her. Between blows, unable to free his arms or legs from her determined squeeze, Virginia held him by the shoulders and slammed his head back against the wood. "Don't you say that!" Mom, screamed Steve. The front door suddenly flew open, and a strong arm grabbed the back cross of Virginia's overalls, pulling her off the boy. "Stop it," said Steve's mother. Virginia went limp in response to the adult command. "She hit me," cried Steve, "for no reason." "We do not fight like that in our house," Steve's mother scolded Virginia. "I am going to speak to your parents." "All of you can go home," she said, pulling Steve into the house. Virginia crossed the driveway to our steps and sat down on the scratchy gray cement. After a short while, Evan opened the door. "Virginia, come on in here and tell me what happened." She pulled herself up to her feet, expecting the worst. Yes, Steve had said a bad word, a really bad word. But she had punched him more than once, and she was older and should have known better. Plus, girls weren't supposed to fight, or so the world had implied to her. She felt the scales of justice were already weighed against her. When she got inside, Evan said, "I just got a call from the lady next door. What happened?" "We were playing sorry, and I won, and that made Steve mad. And then he said a bad word about you 2 times. That's when I hit him. Well, I threw him down on the ground and pounded him." Virginia kept her eyes on her feet as she gave her explanation. "You attacked him," said Evan. "You threw him on the ground and hit him?" "Yeah," she admitted sheepishly. Evan took a big breath. "I understand how you feel when you hear words like that, but sometimes it's better not to haul off and hit someone. You must look around and see what's going on. Each situation is different." "You're not mad?" "No, but this is not the last time you will hear words like that. You need to be careful how you react." Note to Evan. Do you remember this incident? To this day, when Virginia tells the story, she's in shock you were not angry at her for attacking the neighbor boy, and that you actually seemed to show some pride for the way she took the kid on. She shakes her head in amazement that she didn't get in trouble. Young as she was, though, she also seemed to have taken in the lesson you shared with her. It will happen again. This time you weren't hurt, but next time you could be seriously injured or worse. Think carefully about how you respond. It was a message we all had to hear from you. It was a lesson all of us had to take seriously. You were our teacher. You were the only one who knew. Moving from Portland Heights to Northwest Portland had been a shock for all of us, but nothing like the shock of moving from Northwest Portland to Northeast Portland, or more specifically to 19th Avenue between Siskiyou and Stanton Streets. Like Northwest Portland, the neighborhood in Northeast Portland was flat and squared off into symmetrical blocks. But unlike Northwest Portland, this new neighborhood had no sense of hills in the near distance. Instead of a mixture of houses, small businesses, restaurants, and stores, it consisted of block after block of small houses, each with a little yard of its own. More to the point, where Northwest Portland offered a conglomeration of different kinds of people, as diverse as Portland could boast of at that time, our tiny corner of Northeast Portland was solidly white and working class. Until we moved there with our black and white blended family, the dividing lines between the races had held strong at 15th Avenue to the west and Killingsworth Street to the north. Then our family had moved in and broke the color barrier, and the neighbors were not happy. As I walked this new neighborhood on errands to the local store or to the bus stop on 15th Avenue where the Irvington bus passed by, it didn't take long before I began to feel that any time I was out of the house, I might get attacked. Evan was right. There would be more incidents like the one Virginia faced that day. Walking home one day, Virginia and Randy found themselves the object of racial slurs from two older teenagers who lived across and down the street. As the nasty comments behind them heated up, Randy became afraid for Virginia's safety. "When I tell you," he said, "I want you to run home as fast as you can. Don't stop, just go as fast as you can until you get into the house." They took a few more steps before he ordered, "Go." She took off running as he turned around to face the two bigger boys. Then, to his surprise, they did not attack him, but went on their way. A little later, Evan and Randy went to the home down the street to talk with the teens or their parents about the incident and found themselves confronted by the same two large, belligerent boys who looked like they were ready for a fight and had no intention of talking calmly about their behavior. "Don't say anything," Evan said under his breath to Randy and led him quietly away from the house. Note to Evan. What always struck me about this incident was that it showed us how racist white people could not allow themselves to consider black adults as just that, adults. I doubt these two adolescents would have treated a white adult the way they treated you, but they thought they could get away with this behavior when it was you because you were only a black man. It disgusted me, going against everything I had been taught about how to behave. How did it make you feel to have to turn around and lead Randy away from that danger? You knew what had to be done. This was not the moment to confront. But did you give them that look you had? The slow, angry stare that you would give white people that said, "I know what you did. I don't like it. I will remember." Ooh, that was one really hard look. I've practiced it, but I cannot do it like you do. I jumped on the Irvington bus downtown, flashed my student pass, and headed toward a seat in the back. I had just spent a productive hour thrifting at the downtown Goodwill store and had a nice set of used curtains stashed in my backpack that I planned to repurpose as a mini dress. Then I saw Evan sitting by himself halfway to the back of the bus. "Hi," I called out, making my way to the empty seat next to him. He gave me the briefest of nods, his eyes staring straight ahead, his expression unchanged. "I just went to Goodwill. It was so fantastic," I gloated, lost in the excitement of my purchases. He grunted in a low voice deep in his chest. Even after some years of living with him, his behaviors were still often inscrutable to me, so initially I didn't assume there was anything significant about his gruffness that day. "I found these curtains that are not too heavy or thick. The purple color is fantastic. I think they'll make a great dress." He gave me the very slightest nod, but his eyes were frozen on the front of the bus. It suddenly dawned on me that he was trying to communicate something important to me. I looked around and saw we were surrounded by white passengers. It may have been my imagination, but it felt as if they were all leaning slightly towards us to hear better. "Oh," I said, suddenly catching on to what he was trying to tell me. He grunted softly again. I sat back, turned my head forward, and fixed my eyes steadily on the front of the bus. When we got to our stop on 15th Avenue, Evan reached up and pulled the cord. We stayed seated until the bus stopped, and then we both got up quickly and departed from the back door, like strangers who just happened to be getting off at the same place. "Sorry about that," I said as my foot touched the pavement. "No problem," he answered as we started towards home. He didn't say any more about the incident, and I wondered if this was the normal or natural way we should be acting in public, like we barely knew each other. Note to Evan. Evan, I had not realized how a young white girl talking to you could be such a dangerous provocation. In a worst-case scenario, I thought someone might have even followed us off the bus to threaten us on the way home. I realized then that with your silence, you had been trying to protect me. In turn, I needed to protect you with a similar silence. To be safe, we had to pretend we were separated. This truth made me infinitely sad. The longer we lived in Northeast Portland, the more I began to feel like I could not trust anyone outside my family anymore. I couldn't trust my real father or grandparents, and I certainly couldn't extend trust to teachers, principals, or policemen. I had come to live in a constantly guarded manner, feeling isolated and powerless. Distrust was now essential to how I operated. It even manifested in my body, always ready to move at a moment's notice, to evade, look away, creep in stealth. Racism and prejudice had left me feeling like a very different person than I had imagined I would be when I was a little girl, before my parents had divorced. Because I was white, whatever that meant, I could pass into white society if I were alone, or I kept my mouth shut. But I knew people would eventually unlock the truth. Someone would tell them. They would see something, or I would let slip a clue. The tension of revelation made me want to just blurt it out and get it over with. "Okay," I felt like shouting. "My mother married a Negro. My stepfather is black. There. Now you know. Go ahead and reject me. Tease me. Threaten me. Treat me like I've caught a disease. Just get it over with." At the same time as I was plagued by these mounting anxieties, something else was also happening. We were becoming a real family. By real family, I think I meant we not only cohabited the same space, slept and ate in the same house, but that we also played together, made jokes, and told stories about each other, and turned to each other to share our hopes and disappointments. Evan was central to the change that was taking place. In the small detached garage behind our house, we had set up a makeshift ping-pong table, using a sheet of plywood balanced on 2 sawhorses and a cheap tattered net. A small ivy-shaped window let in a few mid-afternoon rays of sun, while Evan and Randy played, and I tried to keep myself flattened against the wall and out of the way of the flying plastic ball. Evan played with Phyllis under one arm, bouncing on his hip, and yet he still dominated the table. He smashed the small white ball from one corner of the table to the other, his rhythmic movement calming Phyllis's chronic colic. Randy, his opponent in this round, darted back and forth from his position at the back of the garage, maintaining a short rally before he lost the next point to a sharp sliced ball that hovered right over the net, only to fall just out of his reach. "How did you do that?" said Randy in frustration. Evan shrugged with false modesty as Phyllis burped with relief. I laughed at Randy's distress, remembering that I, too, had just been bested by the family ping-pong champ. The ping-pong table got a lot of action on the weekends and in the afternoons when Evan was able to join our ongoing matches. He played to win, took no prisoners, and we loved the ruthless spirit that engulfed our games with him. It was undoubtedly a testament to our lack of skill that he could generally best any one of us with a toddler under one arm. Nonetheless, we were sure the next round we would be able to beat him. "Mom wants your help," Virginia shouted at us from the front of the house. Randy and I knew what that meant. Mom was back from food shopping with the old blue station wagon loaded with bags of food that needed to be brought to the kitchen and unpacked. "We'll get you next time," I said to Evan as Randy and I ran to the front sidewalk. Mom had already opened the trunk and was standing by, keys in hand, her big purse hanging from one arm. Randy and I grabbed bags, 2 apiece, and ran them up the front stairs to the porch and then inside through the house to the kitchen in the back. It took several trips to get everything inside, and then we started to unload the food from the bags, trying to figure out where everything went. Mom was the shopper, in large part because she was the only driver. Evan had never learned to drive, and it appeared he wasn't going to learn. He told us that the times he had been stopped by police when he was walking, they couldn't believe there was a black man who didn't know how to drive and didn't have a driver's license. It seemed policemen thought all black men were dying to have the status of car ownership. He, however, took the bus or got a ride with someone else and never worried about the cost of driving. As I sorted out the food in the kitchen, I thought about how Mom and Evan's roles had come into focus. I realized that when Evan had first moved in, I was consumed by trying to figure out who he was, not to mention what it would mean to have a black stepfather who was also a jazz musician. Now, however, my focus was on who they were, meaning Mom and Evan as our parents. He worked at his job as a janitor, played music, and played games with us. And she organized things like mortgage payments, did the food shopping, and drove us where we needed to go. As a parenting couple, however, there was still a lot to learn about them, especially if you were one of the parented. With the groceries sorted out, I disappeared to my sewing space in the basement, hoping to avoid more housework. Even though my bedroom was on the second floor, my sewing space was a corner at the bottom of the basement stairs. These 2 places were where I could go for privacy and quiet, away from the daily chaos of brothers and sisters, cats, dogs, and even gerbils. I sat down at the sewing machine on a chair scavenged from the large collection of scroungy kitchen and dining room chairs lining one wall of the basement. Many were now 3-legged from the frequent wear they'd received from 6 children and 2 adults. The chairs were piled precariously on top of each other in the basement, waiting for a future day when Mom was sure she would be able to get them repaired. The sewing machine sat on a rickety metal cart below a tiny basement window at ground level that provided a dim view of our narrow concrete walkway and the neighbor's driveway. I picked a thread off the machine and turned around to the ironing board behind me to press open the seam of the peasant blouse I was making. A weak light emanated from the bare light bulb overhead, and I squinted as I straightened the fabric with my hands. I knew it was close to 5 p.m. when Randy came down the basement stairs, and I left my sewing to join him in the TV room, as we called it. The TV room was the only finished space in the basement, a small square painted medical white with nothing on the walls. The only furniture in the room was the small black and white TV on its stand and the narrow single bed facing it that served as a couch for watchers. Randy turned the on-off button of the TV and the screen crackled and fuzzed. Then he played with the antenna to improve the reception, which eventually settled down to form a discernible image. Janet came in next to plunk herself down beside me on the far end of the narrow bed couch. Virginia entered with Evan sitting on the floor in front of us. As the show started, Virginia and Randy started singing the familiar words of the theme song. Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip. Janet and I joined them with, that started from this tropic port aboard this tiny ship. Evan was marking time to the song with a swinging finger like a beating metronome, nodding his head up and down. Together we all finished singing the rousing last lines. From 7 stranded castaways here on Gilligan's Isle. It was our favorite time of the day. Time for our mindless descent into Gilligan's Island. We watched it with Evan faithfully on weekdays after he came home from work and before we had dinner. This was also where we gathered to watch Saturday morning cartoons and old black and white movies that were shown on the weekends or late at night. Mom, who preferred books, hardly ever entered this den except for news broadcasts. When she did, we could count on her watching the TV news like she read the newspaper, with an ongoing and audible flow of criticism about them. All of them, it seemed, were doing something wrong, and she knew how it should be corrected. Evan, however, not only liked to watch shows with us, but he also had an encyclopedic knowledge of the old black and white films that were rerun on TV. He told us his mother used to give him a nickel on the weekend and would send him to the movie theater on his bicycle, where he would watch movies for hours, sometimes watching one film 2 or more times. He knew all the actors and actresses in movies from the 1930s through the 1950s and could debate their merits and compare their performances. As the show launched into its zany plot, we laughed hysterically at the antics of Gilligan and the skipper as they spoofed with Ginger, Marianne, the professor, and the rich couple. At times like these, we felt safe, and the voices of the neighborhood were held at bay far away. As a family, I thought, we were like Gilligan and the group of castaways. Like the ocean surrounding Gilligan's Island, prejudice in the neighborhood hemmed in our house, creating the outside boundary we could not cross. On the inside, like Gilligan and the castaways, we were hemmed in by the roles we had taken on and the boundaries these roles set for each of us. For me, I felt more and more restricted by the role I was coming to play as the big sister. In this role, I made meals, packed lunches, walked kids to school, and even attended a brownie meeting with Virginia as her guardian. I also talked to teachers, made excuses, and occasionally took sick kids home from school. I woke young people up and tucked them into bed. Even when I was not taking care of Vaughn and Fee, I was often worrying about them, wondering who was taking care of them and what they might need. Whether or not Mom was at school, in class, or studying, or working, sistering was a full-time occupation for me. Another episode of Gilligan's Island came to an end. We stood up, turned off the TV, and headed upstairs to the kitchen and dinner. Tromping up the narrow wooden stairs from the basement, I wondered if we would ever be allowed to leave the island of castaways, or if we would be stuck here in some form for the rest of our lives. There's hamburger and potatoes on the stove. Judy, can you serve Vaughn and Fee? Janet, can you watch them eat? Mom directed as she left the kitchen for her bedroom. I took 2 plates from the dish drainer and scooped out the crumbled, cooked hamburger and some fried potatoes, handing them to Janet, who shepherded Vaughn and Fee into the dining nook. When we lived in the big green house with my father, Mom was responsible for cooking the dinner, and we all ate together at the table in the kitchen after Dad got home from work. Then, when we moved to the old Victorian, it varied from day to day as to who cooked dinner. Sometimes we ate together and sometimes not. However, when we moved to this house, Mom announced that adults would no longer eat with children. Children would eat earlier and adults would eat later, which she insisted was the European way of doing things. Under this system, she would make something for the meal that she would leave on top of the stove for dinner. Older children would feed younger children, then she and Evan would eat later in their room or the living room. Most of the time, the older children would serve themselves, often arriving at different times. Except for the two youngest, we ate in the kitchen, our bedrooms, or any place else we cared to be. Over the years we lived in this house, the only time we ate together at the dining room table was on Thanksgiving or Christmas, and even then it was dependent on finding enough functioning chairs for everyone. This evening, I made myself a plate of hamburger, potatoes, and ketchup and headed upstairs to my bedroom, a dark, cozy room painted a deep, rich maroon by the previous owners. Seated on my stacked mattresses covered with the bedspread embroidered by my great-grandmother, I ate my dinner as I read a book from the library. The one thing I liked better than sewing was eating alone while reading a book. I could shut out the feeling of the angry neighborhood around me, close my mind to the fears about not getting into college or the widening distance to my father, and hide away. I would gratefully lose myself within the covers of a book. Ironically, I also realized that in eating alone, reading books, I was a spitting image of my mother. After finishing dinner in my room, I wandered back downstairs to drop my empty plate in the sink and then floated into the living room where Evan was seated on the bumpy old forest green couch that had replaced the turquoise couch, which had finally met its end. "Evan, read me a book," said Vaughn, bouncing down on the couch next to his father. "Book," repeated Fee, snuggling into one side. "Okay, what book?" "This one," said Vaughn, grabbing his favorite from the coffee table and handing it to Evan. "No, not that one," I cried. "We've heard it so many times. Can't we do a different one?" "This isn't for you, it's for them," said Evan sternly, looking up to see not only me, but Randy, Janet, and Virginia sitting across from him on the daybed facing the couch. He knew that we too wanted the story, and he shook his head in amazement. He'd not grown up with picture books and parents reading to children. This was a new world he had entered when he joined our family. Despite that, he turned out to be a great picture book reader, and we all liked to listen to him, whether it was an old favorite from our earlier childhood or the new picture books that were emerging in Vaughn and Fee's era. Vaughn's favorite book was The Tomten, a Swedish tale retold by Astrid Lindgren, the author of Pippi Longstocking. The soft blue illustrations and the notion of the kindly Tomten, an elf-like folk character who would go around the snowy farm on a cold night watching over all the animals and making sure things were right, was a message that resonated deeply with my little brother. "Time of Wonder," Janet shouted. "Okay," said Evan, "let's compromise. I will do Vaughn's story and then Time of Wonder." With that, we all leaned back happily, ready to start story time. As Evan read aloud to us, I looked around the living room thinking about who we had become. I didn't think any of the white families on the block who had given us so much trouble could imagine us enjoying a family time like this. Time of Wonder had been my father's special book treat from before we lived in the big green house, before even Virginia was born. A time when we lived in an old farmhouse in southwest Portland down an unpaved road. Randy, Janet, and I loved all of Robert McCloskey's books, from Blueberries for Sal to Make Way for Ducklings. But Time of Wonder was particularly special. My parents had read the book to us so many times that we had most of the text memorized. On a summer's night, Dad would take us on a walk up our little graveled road to a place where there was a small willow tree, under which we would sit and talk about our own special time of wonder, what we saw and what we felt as we sat there in the dark under the stars. Now I was living in a different kind of story time, but I wondered if my father remembered that time of wonder. What, I thought, did it mean to him now? What did I mean to him? Would it bother him if he knew I now listened to someone else read this special book I had loved so much when I was the same age as Vaughn and Fee? By this time, my father and Louise had adopted 2 children, Ellen, a girl Phyllis's age, and Frank, a boy who was a couple years younger. I didn't begrudge him with his new family, but they felt distant from me, as if I'd never had a chance to spend any length of time with them. While Evan read to us, Mom was in the bedroom at the back of the house reading a book alone and eating dinner, as I had been doing only half an hour before upstairs in my bedroom. In many ways, she was an odd mother, so passionate about her reading and her writing, scrambling every day to keep us fed, driving us here and there, and then not actually spending time with us. Her daily activities were often punctuated by monologues about them. One thing I had realized about mothers, them, was that you were never supposed to question her and ask who she was referring to exactly. Them was deliberately inexact. You were supposed to grasp who they were from the context. Often it seemed that them was a conspiracy against her and creatives as she saw herself. Them was local and national, maybe international. Them knew that what they were doing was evil. In the end, them could never be named. My musing about them led me to realize that I was beginning to see Evan, not Mom, as the person whom I would go to when I needed to talk about the hard things. His viewpoint, while informed by the notion of the man, was not obscured as hers was by them. The man was a term that would have shown up in a Black English dictionary, defined as a euphemism for white people who oppress Black people. The man could refer to an individual, but was as likely to refer to a group of people in power or a power structure. This I got, but them was a more complicated term, wrapped around my mother's individual outlook towards the world. Them, as I had come to know it, was judgmental and often got in the way of conversations about things you didn't know the answer to yet. So often the hard but meaningful questions couldn't be answered in a swift, judgmental harangue. Rather, they required probing and thinking. Moms, them, put up barriers to having these kinds of conversations. In the end, it was hard to know exactly what was creating a gap between Mom and me. Was it her need to isolate, her solitary reading, her harangues about them, or her sudden fits of anger? When Evan had finished the picture books, Mom emerged from her bedroom and parceled out the bedtime assignments. Janet got to put Vaughn to bed upstairs, and Mom grabbed Phyllis to put her to sleep in her crib in the dining room. I drifted upstairs back to my bedroom, from where I could soon hear Evan playing the piano that sat near the front door. Note to Evan. It won't come as a surprise to you, Evan, to learn that when I first heard jazz, I thought I wanted nothing to do with it. Send it back. Don't let it in the house. I had no intention of falling prey to this seductive magic. I couldn't really say when I started listening rather than resisting. You didn't require that we like jazz or that we like you. You waited and watched, and gradually, for me, the cacophony started to dissipate as melodies repeated, and I learned that the same scales and chords I'd been taught in my piano lessons had some relationship to the music you were making. When I tried it myself, playing a jazz melody from the fake book that you always kept near at hand and using the chord names that were printed over the melodic line, I realized the way the basic formula could be applied. Understanding how the melody and chords worked inverted the way I had listened to jazz up to that time, and I have been listening differently ever since. My new understanding helped me to see how all music was connected, and at the same time I realized how different and special avant-garde jazz was. You taught me that. It wasn't forced on me, but it was everywhere around us. It was everywhere that you were. Thanks to you, we lived in a jazz house, and I didn't know anyone else my age who did. In a jazz house, if you were not actually playing music, then the record player was on with the jazz LPs stacked up on the spindle ready to drop down when the record below had finished. Sometimes a stuck phonograph needle would grind over and over again on the same few notes. In our house, jazz silence would have been like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. No jazz would have meant death. Our jazz world wasn't just audio. It was also visual, with your jazz records stacked in piles near the record player and lining the living room high up on the decorative ledge so that Phyllis wouldn't be able to grab them. The record covers surrounded us, and we learned who the faces were, what they played, and the tunes associated with the record. I imbibed a huge amount of information about the jazz world from those record covers. But that was not all. You usually had a copy of Downbeat or Jet in your trumpet case or back pocket. Magazines I sometimes read myself. In this way, you delivered many indirect lessons to us about the scope of jazz, its history, notable figures, and their relationships. The longer I lived in what I called a jazz house, the more I realized how I now belonged to a world unknown to my peers. While they were larking around at pep rallies, decorating lockers for the athletic teams, and cheering at the Friday night games, my knowledge of jazz was growing exponentially. No wonder I often felt I had little in common with those peers. Looking back, I couldn't say how it happened that one day John Coltrane's Giant Steps meant nothing to me. Then suddenly the next day it seemed I was humming the tune to the record, my voice descending down the steps along with Coltrane's saxophone. It just seemed to happen magically, tune by tune. Jazz became like the snow-peaked mountains in the distant view, always there, defining the Portland horizon. Jazz, like the mountains, had also become part of my familiar landscape. This we all attribute to you. Despite all the fears and tensions we faced in our gray world, a world that sat between white and black, when I thought about all the things that made home to me, ping pong, Gilligan's Island, listening to Evan reading picture books, being awash in the jazz cascading through the house, and maybe even some German chocolate cake, I wished I could freeze moments like this forever. Maybe I didn't want to leave the island of castaways. But there was no avoiding it. Fall was coming, and once again, I would have to accommodate myself to yet another new school. The third I would be attending since my parents had separated just a few years before. Thank you to Westford Community Access Television for providing facilities and production support, all of which made this podcast possible.